Hello, everyone, and welcome to the High Tunnel Berry Production webinar series. My name is Leslie Holland. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist in fruit crop pathology at UW-Madison. And today we're going to be talking about brambles. We have two invited speakers today, Harlene Hatterman-Valenti and Tom Kahn. Harlene is from North Dakota State University. She started there in 2000, and her research is directed towards production and weed management issues for small fruits and vegetables. Her project has been involved in high tunnel research for almost 10 years, focusing on season extension aspects. Her current research is investigating the use of caterpillar tunnels for grape, primocane blackberry, and primocane raspberry production. And Tom, our second speaker today, is an assistant professor at North Carolina State University in the Department of Horticultural Sciences. Tom has a multi-state appointment and serves the apple industry in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. His research and extension program is focused on the development and optimization of cultural and chemical practices to increase orchard productivity and profitability. Additionally, his program has expanded to parallel horticultural research on caneberries. Now, we're going to start today with our speaker, Harlene, but we'd like to encourage everyone to keep your cameras off throughout the presentation, as well as continue to stay muted. We will take your questions in the chat, and we'll answer all questions for both speakers at the end of our webinar today. And we hope you all stick around as well for a quick survey we'd like to ask all of you. And additionally, our work today, this webinar series, is brought to you by not only UW-Madison, but our collaborators at the University of Minnesota Extension, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Extension, and Iowa State University as well. So with that, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Harlene. And again, if there's any questions, please enter those in the chat and we'll answer them at the end.
Okay. There, hopefully everyone can see this. Want to thank for this opportunity to stand in for Annie Claude. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more on raspberries and blackberries in a high tunnel environment. Okay, let's see. There we go. So there's a lot of benefits to growing brambles, raspberries, blackberries in a high tunnel production system. And you can see a list of those. But I think the main one is the quality aspects. Having that high tunnel eliminate rainfall during that fruiting process increases the quality immensely. You can see there's a few other there's a number of other advantages or benefits to the high tunnel. And in some cases, these may be greater because of your area or less because of your area. And so, for example, the larger fruit size, that may not always occur because of the cultivar that you're using or your location. But the example that is given there shows that on the left are the high tunnel raspberries from the identical cultivar as those seen in the right. So I'm going to think about the main thing of a high tunnel is to extend your season. And how are we going to do that with brambles? So if we have primocane raspberries, we can shoot for earlier season by utilizing a floating row cover in the spring, because it's going to go and warm up faster, of course, and thus, but we're still going to have those problems no matter where you're at of some kind of a low or an Arctic blast in our springtime, and which our temperatures probably drop to that sensitive temperature where you're going to have some tissue damage. So by using these floating row covers, you can go and protect that new growth from being burnt or, I guess, frozen and causing damage. You can also utilize pinching or tipping of these plants. Say you have a high tunnel with all one cultivar, you can use the pinching or tipping to go and delay flowering, thus kind of spreading out your season even longer. You can, and that will increase the branching and, of course, the number of inflorescence. And if you have a long enough season, you could probably even do a double pinch or a double tip. Then when you think about the primal canes, their main part of fruit production is in that fall period. And so with the high tunnels, you're going to, again, need to utilize those floating row covers to go and get you through a few of those nights that the temperature drops below freezing. And especially, high tunnels, they will go and they will help to not have that temperature go a few degrees less than what the outside temperature is, but they don't have the capability to go and give you, let's say, that 25 degrees, that 7-degree difference in your nighttime temperature or early morning temperature, because it's plastic. Plastic does not go and actually eliminate that temperature. So you will have to go, and if you get down to those 25-degree nights, use those floating row covers. Also, you can go and overwinter then these primal canes and double crop. And so to do that, though, there's a lot of work depending on your location to go and get that to work. With blackberries, and I'm going to give you an example here shortly, it doesn't work as well just because primal cane blackberries have a later flowering period, so it's difficult to really take advantage of the situation, and even with a high tunnel to go and have that season extended long enough to make that work. They also don't produce as much fruit, so the primal canes in comparison to the flower canes, so it's a little bit more difficult. In our trial that I'm going to talk about, we used 4 of the Arkansas primal canes: Prime Jim, Prime Jan, Primark 45, and Primark Freedom. And we looked at 3 environments: a single poly high tunnel versus the open field, bare ground. And then we thought maybe with a silver mulch, you can get more reflectance of the light into the canopy, and look how that would go and influence our growth, yield, etc. We did use 3 tipping or, as I said, pinching treatments, where we did no tipping, a single tip, and then a double tip. And here's just an illustration of those 3 environments. The bare ground or open field, right next to it was the silver mulch. And then you can see that single poly high tunnel with those 4 cultivars. And then the bottom picture is just a side view of the trial that my graduate student set up and did. So when we looked at the influence of tipping on flowering, we see that when we look at our 3 environments, actually the high tunnel, there was no significant difference, even though you do see a little bit of delay. That was not significantly different. With the silver mulch, that we must have gotten a little bit more light reflectance in there, because with that single tip, we see no difference to no tipping, but with the double tipping, there just wasn't enough growth response to go and make a difference. And you can see how that delayed flowering. With the bare soil, either of those tipping methods delayed flowering. And in North Dakota, that was really terrible because we already have one of the shortest growing seasons for any of the states. And so you're really almost eliminating all of your fruiting. So looking at that, it's very promising that we could maybe offset some delay with tipping and delay in flowering by tipping and thus getting more fruit. However, when we look at this for our 4 cultivars, we see that yes, for single tipping, we for the 4 cultivars, we could in the high tunnel actually, and I better set this up a little bit better. So you can see Julian days where January is 1, and then you just keep on counting your days. The gray bar indicates single tipping, and the black bar indicates double tipping. And so when we look at the high tunnel, we see that in comparison, although we could only go and we couldn't statistically compare, but you can see that with the high tunnel and single tipping, we're right around on average, let's say about 165 days. When we look at the silver mulch in all 4 of these cultivars, we're from 170 to 176, somewhere around 174 days. And then in bare ground or bare soil, we were over 180 days. So we can see that we were able to kind of overcome some of that. But when we looked at these individual cultivars, we saw that it only in silver mulch could we do really any difference, and that was with Primark Freedom for the double tipping. And then in bare soil, Prime Jim was with the double tipping was earlier than the other cultivars. What happened was that well, let's go on to the next one. When we talk about fruit production, we did not see any yield differences between any of the cultivars. When we looked at the tipping, though, what we did have some differences in that you can see that the double tipping just was making everything too late. And so our only difference was that when we double tipped, we got only not even a half a pound of fruit per plant. Well, no, that's 0.6 ounces. For the single tipped or the control, no tipping, we didn't even get a half a pound, but it was much more than what we could get with double tipping. And again, that was because of how short our season was, had lots of fruit there, but when you delay and then you get cold temperatures, this is what happens. When we looked at the cultivars, again, we couldn't really make comparisons between the high tunnel and the silver mulch because we didn't have high tunnels replicated, but we could make some generalizations. In this, for the high tunnel, what we did see is that Primark Freedom, because the fruit was longer, as you can see here, 3.11 in length, and wider, it ended up weighing almost twice as much, the fruit, in comparison to the other 3 cultivars. However, what happened is Primark Freedom then did not produce as many fruit, and so even though the fruit was larger and weighed more, the yields were identical or not different for the 4 cultivars in the high tunnel. We did see that there was almost a double increase, twice as much fruit in the high tunnel compared to the other two. However, again, that was really low in comparison to how much work it took. And thus we went and really for blackberry, primal cane blackberries, especially in North Dakota, we can't say that a single poly high tunnel would be beneficial or be economically feasible to go and try to do primal cane blackberries. We haven't examined a double poly high tunnel, which provides a little bit better insulation, a few more degrees than a single poly. And we did not use any of those floating roll covers to go and try to even further our season. So let's go then into, say you're considering, especially something like raspberries, to go and grow in your high tunnel. What are some of the things you need to consider before you transplant? Well, the first off is, of course, your soil and nutrient management. And there was a specialty crop research initiative grant a few years ago where it was entitled Tunnel Berries, where they actually looked at the production of brambles in high tunnels. And that included Michigan State, Cornell, a number of states more towards the east of the Midwest. And anyway, so I'm not going to try to get into all the specifics on soil and nutrient management, but there is a excellent web page that has a number of articles, and they also have 12 webinars on soil and nutrient management. And the example that we have here on nitrogen timing and brambles actually came from one of those presentations in which they're talking about the timing for your nitrogen. The next thing we should consider is our cropping history. A lot of our high tunnels probably initially started with tomatoes and peppers because those seem to be one of the biggest net return crops for a high tunnel. Well, the problem with that is those are solanaceae crops, and they generally have verticillium problems, issues. And our brambles, raspberries and blackberries, are extremely sensitive to verticillium wilt. A lot of times commercial production of raspberries, they'll only leave them in the ground about 3 years because of how susceptible they are to verticillium wilt. So if you had solanaceae crops in that high tunnel, you shouldn't follow that with raspberries or blackberries. Herbicide carryover probably isn't as much of a problem. Many of the high tunnels are organic or very sustainable, where they're using more of the cultural control methods for weed control. So herbicide carryover probably isn't much of a concern, but in some cases it could. So now we're on to, what kind of crops we should be, or cultivars we should be planting. And I'm not going to go over all of these. These are some of the recommended from that trial. It was a 5-year study where they looked at the various cultivars for high tunnels and have recommended these. So here's our red raspberry, floricane fruiting raspberries. And you can look at this later when it's posted for more specifics. They also had recommendations for black raspberries as well as purple raspberries. And this is what I really want to make sure, though, is that you don't think that just because these are recommended for that area, that they'll do well no matter where your high tunnel is. Make sure that the cultivar you're going to select is hardy for your area, because just because you have a high tunnel doesn't mean you can go and use a less hardy raspberry or blackberry than what your area would take um, in the open field. Because, for example, in Williston, they had a small high tunnel where they went and planted raspberries, and they had them in the open field right next to it and the high tunnel. Well, in the winter, they went and they closed the sides because they were concerned about snow load onto the high tunnel. Well, what happens then is you get sunny days and you get warming, and then at night it gets freezing again during the winter. So you have this fluctuation, a large fluctuation of temperatures. And the following spring, when they went and opened up their high tunnel and were waiting for the raspberries to go, and these were floricane months, so they had the primal canes growing there, waiting for them to go and break bud. None of them broke bud because of all the temperature fluctuation and freezing and thawing and like that. It killed them completely. And so you're going to need to, especially if you have the floricane ones, you're going to need to go and open up your sides so that it is the same temperature, it maintains the same temperature as it is outside, and you don't have a whole bunch of fluctuation in temperatures. Here are the primal cane red raspberries that were recommended. And these are some more of those. I think everyone can relate probably to Heritage, a very old and traditional raspberry. The golden raspberry, primal canes. And I like this actually diagram because, early, mid, late, really for fruit production, it can mean something very different depending on where you live. And so what I like about this figure is it kind of gives you more of a time frame instead of just using such subjective terms as early, mid, and late. And you can see how Joan J, Polana, and Polka are the earliest ones in about when they will start. So let's go on to planting, irrigating, and trellising then. In the high tunnel, you're going to go and put your raspberries. I'm going to focus on raspberries because in our location, I know blackberries aren't going to be a focus, and maybe some other places they might, but for the most part, I think raspberries have the biggest potential. And you're going to put those at 18 to 24 inches between the plants, and you're going to put your rows a little bit closer together, 7 to 8 foot between your rows. Right away, put in your irrigation so that you can achieve an inch of water a week. If you have sandier soils, you might have to go and actually put down 2 drip lines, because in a sandier soil, you don't have much horizontal movement of that water. And to encompass that whole root zone, 2 drip tapes might be needed. Of course, you're going to need to support these plants because they will grow a lot taller than they would out in the open field. And so the trellising you can see on your right is just 2 conduit poles that they put together, and then they used a plastic wire to go and to attach those wires for support. On the bottom is an example of a V trellis, and that works out really nice if you're trying to double crop. with the primal canes, and then get floor canes off of those. With that V trellis, they'll go and they'll tie the floor canes to the outside, to the V's, and in the middle, then the primal canes will be coming up. Thus, then when the floor canes, which will flower and fruit earlier than the primal canes, you'll remove those floor canes, and then you can then put your primal canes to where the floor canes were in working on that. Other things that you need to consider is controlling the environmental conditions and pests, of course. The main thing with the high tunnel is that soil salinity, especially in these areas where we have 4-season high tunnels. We don't ever take the plastic off. Therefore, you just tend to increase your soluble salts. And even though strawberries are a lot more sensitive to soluble salts than raspberries or blackberries, they still can be affected by that. So it is recommended that whenever you go and going to replace your plastic, you go and leave that the plastic off long enough to go and get a lot of rainfall or snow so that you can help leach those soluble salts. What we've done in the past is we've actually shoveled snow into our high tunnel so that we can help go and leach those soluble salts below the root system. Another problem that might occur is getting a hard pan. And so if you think you might have a hard pan in that high tunnel, you need to go and subsoil before you transplant, because there's no way of getting rid of that hard pan afterwards. As far as weeds and insects, weeds, I generally will put down a landscape fabric to walk on between the rows, and over time you really don't have a lot of weed problems. If you have any kind of perennials, of course, the best, you have to get rid of those before you transplant, because otherwise it's going to be a downhill battle that you most likely will not win. There are a number of insects that are problematic in high tunnels. The most problematic would be the spotted winged Drosophila, which you see down in the corner, in which they really love raspberries. And depending on your location, when they're most prevalent, they can be quite a battle. They have been looking, a lot of places have been looking at exclusion netting. But if you do something like that, you need to consider the fact that you're excluding all pollinators, all kinds of insects, and so you're going to have to bring in some bumblebees for pollination on that. And that exclusion netting, even though it drastically reduces the number of spotted winged Drosophila, the research that I've seen indicates it doesn't eliminate them. Thus, they'll creep a little bit more, but you won't have that explosion where you just lose all of your fruit. One of the biggest problems I generally encounter in high tunnels is the two-spotted spider mite. These high tunnels give you that warmer temperature, heat, dryness, perfect conditions for spider mites. And again, I'm not going to go into any of the control methods. I think I just want you to be aware of some of the problems. Tarnished plant bugs can be a problem, generally aren't as big of a problem. And one nice thing is if you have problems with Japanese beetles, high tunnels do great at repelling those, just because of the UV rays with the plastic elimination. It really kind of messes with them, they stay away from that for the most part. So do honeybees somewhat, but if you have plants towards the outside next to your tunnel, they'll probably come in and because they just love raspberries. Bumblebees aren't influenced, and that's why if they're put in pollinators, they'll get the bumblebees for the pollinators. I'm going to go over this quickly because I'm probably getting close. I am getting close to running out of time here. Diseases aren't near as much of a problem, but there are some that you have to consider. And the two most frequent are powdery mildew and rust. And the picture of a rust is up there. And the reason why they have some problems with these two diseases is because they're favorable with high humidity. They don't need water on the leaves like a lot of the other diseases. So with that high humidity, you'll have those problems. Gray mold does need that water, and this is on the fruit. So what you'll see is if some of your plants near the outside of the tunnel or at the ends, if the ends are open, they get rained on, you might have some problems with gray mold. What the other picture that we're showing here is sun scald. Of course, you have those hot, sunny conditions, much warmer in your high tunnel. And there's Heritage and Goldie are known to be very susceptible to sunburn or sun scald. I'm not going to go into wildlife because I think every situation can be different. We've had problems with raccoons, and so we've put a fencing so that they couldn't get in when the sides were up. Others have talked about problems with mice and of course drip tape. So with that, I just have, this is for later when it is posted. Again, there's a number of videos that talk about bramble production in high tunnels that I wanted you to be aware of. I didn't go into containers. We did try a small study with containers, and very, very difficult for us to go and try to manage. And then it was just with our temperatures in North Dakota, it was not very successful. So I didn't even discuss that. And with that, I'm going to stop my sharing and have Tom take over.
Excellent. Thank you, Harlene. And Tom, you are free to share your presentation.
Great, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a bunch of people at NC State and Clemson University that helped conduct the bulk of this work. I'll be describing a series of trials that were initiated back in 2018 that relate to trying to identify new strategies for caneberry canopy management. I could have easily titled this talk "A Series of Failures and a Few Glimmers of Hope," but I don't know that anyone would have attended. So currently in North Carolina, I should begin, primarily we're producing blackberries in principle. There's a few growers that do produce some raspberries, but we have challenges with heat and in raspberry production, particularly as it relates to influencing flowering on raspberry. But here in the mountainous portion of North Carolina, we do have some success, and there is some expansion in that area. But in principle, the way that we manage our caneberries here are through one of three areas. There's pruning that can occur during the dormant season or during the summer. Training techniques, primarily cane bending, and then there's been some work on the East Coast by Fumi Takada that looked at using defoliation is another strategy to try to improve bud break of caneberries, and finally genetic control. Outside of the standard pruning practices that occur during dormancy, the way that we really manage our canopy throughout the course of the summer is through summer tipping, as Harlene already mentioned. And in general, this is an effective primocane management growth strategy. There was a great body of work conducted by Bernadine Strick out at Oregon State University that demonstrated that tipping has positive influence on lateral branch development, which then increases your potential bearing surface of the plant, and as a result will increase yields in many cases. And the number of times that you would summer tip blackberries would really depend on your goals and also your region and location. Now, there are some challenges with tipping. Here in the Southeast, we conducted a survey back in 2017, and it became apparent that there was a wide range of practices that were being employed. Some people would tip twice. We can get away with a double tip down here because we do have quite a long growing season. And in some cases on floricane fruiting blackberries, there'd be growers that would tip up to 5 times in a given growing season. And in general, this costs about $600 per acre when going across a modern blackberry field. Now, some of the challenges here that might be just specific to the southeastern United States is that if you're a little late with this procedure, and rather than doing a soft tipping where you're physically removing that succulent tissue and you end up having to hard tip them or use pruning shears to cut some of those structures, that opens up some wounds that potentially pathogens could begin to develop in. There are a series of, as I understand it, pathogens that can cause cane dieback on blackberry, but in particular, cane blight is one of our principal issues, and it can cause the mortality of the canes, or in some cases of the entire plant. So it's pretty serious business down here. So that late tipping can be problematic, at least in our region. And as I understand it, in more northern regions, this isn't as much of a problem. So when it comes to bending and training canes, you can generally get some lateral branch response from that activity alone. And then when you pair that up with defoliation, in some cases that will also delay the development of flower bud production, which in some markets that might be desirable, perhaps not so much in the upper Midwest. However, in some of our work, we were able to observe increased lateral branching with bending, but whenever we employed the use of defoliation and bending, that was generally detrimental to yield and fruit quality and fruit size. And finally, the other area that's very exciting and being led by the University of Arkansas is actually looking at genetic control mechanisms of plant architecture. That group, led by now retired John Clark and now Margaret Worthington, have a series of really exciting cultivars available that range from, on the far left here, with baby capes being a true dwarf, more of a semi-dwarf with ponca in the center. And then compare that to Natchez, which is noted to have extremely long internodal distance. It's quite dramatic. All these plants were just plugs that we started at the same time in a potted experiment, but that just really demonstrates the range of vigor that you can have with some of these selections. And baby cakes wouldn't necessarily be suited for field or high tunnel production, but would make a bit more sense in a hanging basket on someone's patio. So I got into this whole thing in a really kind of backwards way. I was hired on as an apple physiologist here in the southeastern United States. And what kind of occurred is that there were some growers that were really keen to see if there were any utilities for plant growth regulators in blackberry. And to this point, plant growth regulator use is quite limited in blackberry. And the only labeled use that I'm aware of is the use of ethifon, and that's primarily done in the Pacific Northwest, where they have a larger processing industry and can utilize machine harvesting of blackberries. And ethifon would be used to promote uniform ripening for that mechanized harvest procedure. So as I indicated, there was some local interest in trying to evaluate this, and I had some experience with plant growth regulators from all of my work in apple to this point. So I dove right in 2018. And we looked at the use of ethifon to delay the timing of harvest based on some previous work. and also look to see if we could identify any branching agents, particularly that of bromelain. And we did a fair amount of work too with a growth retardant called prohexadione calcium. And that was very successful in reducing cane height of blackberries, but it also had negative impacts on yield and productivity. So we discontinued that line of research, and I won't describe that in this presentation. So getting back to our application efforts to try to see if we could alter the harvest timing of primocane fruiting blackberry in the southeastern United States. This was based on some work done back in the 80s on heritage raspberry to see if indeed we could retard growth and delay harvest. So we conducted some work on traveler blackberry in 2018 and just wanted to see if we could identify an effective range of concentrations. So we went the whole way from a control up to 600 parts per million ethafon to see if that would work. And the original plan was to apply that in 3 applications every other week. After our first application, we found out very quickly that this area was not worth conducting further research on. We observed pretty severe twisting and curling of plant stems. This is referred to as epinasty. And as you can see on the image on the right, so a lot of that tissue would kind of lignify and harden. And those canes would basically sit in that kind of curled up fetal position for the bulk of the season, and they didn't throw any flowers or fruit. But what we did observe was a flush of new primocanes that developed. So in all likelihood, to get to the same point of delaying harvest, you could do that by simply pruning all of the primocanes if you really wanted to do that. And we deem that as an unsuccessful area of work. We used other model crop systems to see if we could effectively stimulate lateral branching, in this case using bromelain. And we compared that to a standard tipping treatment. So this soft tipping procedure, just to show some images here, you have your terminal bud growing right there. You would go in and physically remove the terminus of that shoot. You can do that with your hands or with pruning shears. Generally, again, because of pathogen issues, we're following up with a fungicide application within 24 hours of that event. And then the idea would be that you would then stimulate locally some of these lateral buds to then develop into shoots. Whenever we applied bromelain, all we really observed was phytotoxicity due to the surfactant that we included in that, and deemed that as unacceptable, and also a line of research that we wanted to discontinue. I didn't quite give up on plant growth regulators and tried another trial here over the past 2 years. And there was another body of work, I believe, based out of Kentucky, where in a potted experiment, Malik and Archibald were able to stimulate lateral branching of primocane fruiting raspberry with 100 parts per million 6-benzoadenine, which is a cytokinin, and GA3, which is a gibberellin. And as a result, we wanted to see, hey, can we throw some branches there? So we did this on some floricane fruiting blackberry in Mills River, North Carolina, and again, wanted to identify an effective rate of treatment. So went the whole way from 0 up to 800 parts per million of these 2 products combined. And again, applied this in a total of 3 times at 3-week intervals until we started to see flower bud development. In this case, we did not observe any impact on lateral branching, unfortunately, or had any impact on many of the cane characteristics that were of interest. The only thing that we really observed here, unfortunately, was that as you increase the rate of these 2 products together, we saw a marked reduction in yield, and it didn't matter if you looked at yield in terms of total yield, marketable or unmarketable. So pretty frustrating to see that some of these applications didn't carry over into a different cropping system. I'm not going to give up on this quite yet, but nonetheless, I think it's important to acknowledge failure from time to time. So again, so far with all of the chemistries that we've evaluated, we've not been able to have considerable or significant effect on lateral branching. And so far, it seems like this is a bit of a dead end, but we will investigate stronger plant growth regulators and alternate use patterns to see if we can stimulate that further. This did kind of become, I think, what would be really valuable to understand at some point, and it'd be interesting from some that are on the call to see if they have other thoughts on this. But One thing that I'm just curious about is, what is the true mechanism of apical dominance, and what's the main limitation of lateral branching in this cropping system? I wonder if that's completely understood to this point. Blackberries are in general a pretty young cropping system whenever it comes down to it compared to others. So we initiated some work about 2 years ago looking at the use of reflective ground covers in blackberry production systems. And this differs a little bit from Harlene had mentioned with some of the reflective films that were placed near the base of the plant canopy to reflect light into that lower canopy. These actually are woven textiles that generally stretch and cover about 70 to 80% of that row middle. And the idea is that incoming radiation will then be reflected off of this and into the canopy to potentially have impacts on not only that canopy microclimate, but also to see if you could have impacts on fruit quality or potentially vegetative growth characteristics. So that's why this area became of interest to us. There has been some neat work done on this already, and a lot of it was done up in New Brunswick, Canada, with a particular reflective ground cover called Extende. And with that product, they were able to observe an increase in marketable yield of 48% with that material and an 11% increase in fruit weight. This treatment also improved and increased the amount of vegetation produced, which might not necessarily always be a good thing to have a more dense, thick, voluminous canopy whenever you think of things like spray coverage and also harvesting. There was some effort to quantify if there was any reduction of spur blight in these systems, and there indeed was with reflective ground cover as compared to a sod ground cover. And there were no effects on other pathogens. The only real insect focus in this was on ground beetle populations in this body of work, and there was no effect on that either. So we conducted some work just about an hour and a half from where I'm based down in Clemson, South Carolina, at Clemson's Musser Fruit Research Farm. And we simply just wanted to compare the effects of a sod ground cover to that of an Extende ground cover. This block was a 3 by 12 foot spacing, mature block of Osage, which is floricane fruiting. And we modified our pesticide program in here. We wanted to see the impacts of this material on spotted wing Drosophila. So it was a basically, we didn't apply any targeted insecticides to manage SWD in this plot, and also a reduced fungicide program. So only Captan was applied on about a 14-day interval to see if we would have any impacts on insects and disease incidents in these plots as well. For the sake of time today, I'm just going to discuss the effects on canopy microclimate, yield, and vegetative growth. And if there's time for questions in the other areas, I'm happy to answer that. Just to show you what this looks like a little bit closer. So again, this is a woven textile. It's highly reflective, and you mount this to, in apples, we would typically mount to the trunks of trees, but in this case, we were mounting to our trellis system. In many cases, just a simple T-post would suffice, and they have a proprietary mounting system, which is simply bungee cords that you can also attach to claws on the side, or on the corners. You use a different mechanism there to actually affix that to the canopy so it stays in place. You can drive over this material with a tractor with no problems, and it's designed for that purpose. So orchard traffic is not necessarily an issue unless if it would be deemed excessive and cause premature wear of the material. To get to some of our results here, we had a market, it was about a 10-fold increase in photosynthetically active radiation that was reflected by this particular ground cover relative to the control treatment. We also quantified UV light with a simple point measurement there with a UV meter that was between 250 and 400 nanometers. And we saw about a 20-fold increase in UV light reflection with this ground cover as compared to sod ground cover. And again, because of time, we also quantified temperature, relative humidity in these plots. As you expect with more UV light, you would see higher temperatures, which may or may not be desirable for your specific application. Where this gets really interesting, I suppose, is that we saw in the first year of treatment, we saw dramatic impacts on vegetative growth and development of primocanes. So we saw an increase in cane circumference, the total node number per cane, the number of lateral branches, and where this becomes really intriguing is it's a 41% increase in lateral branching with the use of this reflective ground cover relative to the control. And if you have a longer branch, you'd also have more leaf area on those lateral branches as well. We doubled our lateral branch length, 37% increase in total linear bearing surface. And we doubled our lateral leaf area and nearly doubled our total leaf area. So profound impact on the growth and development of these canes. What became of interest to us in the subsequent year, in that spring, was to see if these treatments actually resulted in lateral branches that were usable, that were within the fruiting zone, within an area that we typically wouldn't prune off with our current management systems. And we were pleased to find out that we observed an increase in lateral branch number and also the total linear bearing surface, and that was about a 30% increase right there. And when it came to harvesting in the second year after deployment, we applied the same fabric to the same plots for 2 consecutive years. We saw about a 30% increase in yield with these reflective ground covers. I realize that this webinar series is all about high tunnel production, and I do really wonder about the utility of this material in high tunnels. That is something that we are planning to test in the upcoming season if all goes to plan. So in summary, managing branching with plant growth regulators still remains quite elusive to this point. The use of reflective ground covers did have a profound impact on the canopy microclimate. Now, we only tested one specific type of reflective ground cover in this work that I've presented here, and other trials that we've done since then. We've looked at other ground covers with different reflective properties. So there are some reflective ground covers that will reflect just as much photosynthetically active radiation, but are able to absorb more of that UV. So for some cropping systems or some regions, that might be quite desirable, but still requires testing across multiple areas, in my opinion. And finally, I think that while, again, still more development is required, the use of Extend-A Daybreak ground cover did have a profound impact on lateral branching and productivity, and merits further investigation in other cropping systems and situations like high tunnel production. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding sources, many of the people that also were involved in the data collection, treatment application, et cetera, throughout the course of this study. And I also just want to thank you for your time and interest. And with that, I'll close it up so we can get to questions and whatnot. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. Okay, well, after 2 great presentations, I've already seen a couple questions enter the chat, so I'll start with those. But in the meantime, other folks, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat for our speakers. So the first question that we got early on, I believe during Harlene's presentation, was, will you be discussing tipping of floricane fruiting raspberries? And I believe we...
Sorry, could you, I was thinking Josie wanted some kind of, oh, maybe not. I thought she wanted to do some kind of a survey or something, or was that afterwards, after or before?
That's great, Harlene. Thank you for the reminder. So we can actually launch that right now for folks in attendance as we answer questions. Yep. From our speakers, there's a quick poll that we'll have folks complete.
And Leslie, could you repeat that question then for me?
Yes, I certainly will while folks are answering those questions. So the question was in regards to discussing tipping of floricane fruiting raspberries.
Mm-hmm. So can you tip them? Yes. Or is it, what do they want to know?
Just a matter of discussing floricane, tipping floricane fruiting raspberries.
Generally, that's not done as much. But tipping would go and increase the your number of inflorescence, and it would also delay your maturity, so your flowering time.
Great, thank you. And I still see some answers coming in for the poll, so we'll continue to leave that up. Another question that came in, I believe, during Tom, your presentation, in North Dakota, what are your best performing floricane red raspberry in outdoor setting?
In North Dakota?
Yes, I believe this came up.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Prelude is been good. Polka has been good. Those are, did you say primal cane or floricane? Well,
This is for floricane red raspberry
Okay.
specifically. Mm-hmm.
Killarney has been really well for us outdoors. Dr. Wenhow Dye has been doing most of this work, and so there's stuff published on that. But Polana has been, from what I remember, one of his better ones. We have problems more on winter injury, even with with the reds, we still have winter injury problems with our red raspberries. And of course, if we went to purples or blacks, we have very little success with that because of the winter injury and how they're not as cold hardy as the reds.
Great, thank you. And I know you shared quite a few resources in your presentation, and I did enter into the chat the recordings where folks can find the recordings of this webinar series, including today's webinar, so they can go back and look at those slides and see the different links. And I believe there's a link in the chat I put earlier that I'm happy to repost about something you had in your presentation, Harlene. Other questions from our audience? We've got a couple minutes here. I'll put that resource back in. Couple thank yous in the chat for our speakers. And I entered that resource that was shared previously on high tunnel production that came from Cornell. And as we wait for potentially some more questions to enter the chat, we'll do a reminder of our upcoming and final webinar for our high tunnel berry production series, which will be here in a couple weeks on April 13th on controlling the environment in a high tunnel. So you can go ahead and get registered for this particular webinar at our webpage, and that's going to come to you in the chat right now. And as I mentioned before and put in the chat, you can watch all of the previously recorded webinars, not only from this year, but in previous years when we've had other berry-based webinars on our YouTube channel.
And Leslie, I wanted to go and so we've been looking at, Dr. Dye's been looking at the primal cane ones as also summer fruiting. So he's been looking more at, getting a crop in the fall on the primal canes and then keeping them for floricanes in the summer. So. Okay.
Is that information available online as well?
I could go and try to find that. I would think it would be.
Okay, yeah, that might be great for the folks here today, especially we can maybe post it in conjunction with the upload of our YouTube video for this.
Yep, I will find that.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other final questions as we wrap up this afternoon with our speakers? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Well, I'll thank both of our speakers today, Harlene and Tom. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.